Here's the sourdough SunOven focaccia and or pizza that we make at our house. Both the pizza and the focaccia actually start with the exact same dough that I use to make loaf bread. My preferred method of making sourdough is not the most common one. I start with this lump of dough that is stored from last time in the icebox. To it, I add about 5/8 of a cup of really warm water, and I dissolve the dough in it with my hands. Then work in about 3/4 of a cup of flour, and we've been using spelt flour, but any kind will do. This creates what's known as a sponge. The sponge goes in a nice warm place to rise until it looks like this, all bubbly. Now it's time to make the actual dough. I add 1 scoop of soy protein powder, which you do not have to do, but we like our bread to be high protein if possible, and contrary to popular opinion, it will rise just fine. Then another 3/4 of a cup of flour, and start working it in. Also salt to whatever taste the family has. Not a good idea to overdo the salt, however, because it can inhibit rising. Sometimes you do need a little extra flour. If the dough is still too sticky, that's the case. And for some reason, it can vary a lot from time to time based on anything from the kind of flour to the weather. But get all the flour you need to absorb into the dough and make it knead nicely and not be overly sticky. You see me kneading one-handed here. Obviously, 2 hands is more efficient, but then I would have been in the way of your view, so I was willing to do it with 1. And once all my flour is in there, I knead on for about 5 minutes. Having used a sponge, the yeast is already very active, so you don't need to knead a long time, but the texture does seem to get nicer and more satiny and less sticky with a few minutes of kneading. So that's what I go for. Now the dough is smooth and pliable and doesn't leave any crumbs anywhere. In fact, it'll pick them up and isn't sticky. It just feels good, and it's time. I'm going to pull off a handful now, literally a handful, I don't measure, and put it in the container for next time sourdough. It does take a container a good bit bigger than the actual lump of dough because sometimes it rises a little even though it's cold. Up to this point, both focaccia and pizza dough are just the same for us, and they remain the same for the next couple of steps. A little bit of oil into the pan we're going to use to cook, get it on both sides of the dough, and spread the dough out to fill the pan. And this is where the 2 dishes begin to diverge. For focaccia, I spread it perfectly evenly and then put fingertip impressions into the dough and set it to rise. For pizza, I work it to the corners, but don't make it perfectly even. I raise the edges just a little bit so that the toppings will have a fence around them more or less. I do, in both cases, flip the dough over to make sure it's really oiled on both sides because it just behaves better that way for us. Ideally, the dough will be perfectly even in the pan with an evenly turned up and evenly thick edge for pizza. Now, whichever dish we're making, we set the dough to rise until it's risen quite a bit. I let it rise longer and higher for focaccia than for pizza. And of course, the rising time is very much weather dependent and to some degree dependent on your exact yeast in your sourdough. You're looking at uncovered dough that has risen, but while rising, I always put a dish towel over it. For focaccia, we may put a little bit of extra olive oil on top of the dough and then sprinkle it with bagel seasoning or garden herbs, either one. Fresh rosemary leaves make it very nice. Now it's ready to go in the SunOven. Solar cookers will understand the time is highly variable, but last time I made this, it took about an hour on a day with about half cloud cover. The oven stayed at 235 to 250. We get the most successful pizza by baking the dough halfway or a little bit more before adding the toppings. So the pizza I made today, again, a partly cloudy day, stayed in 40 to 45 minutes with just dough. Pretty much any pizza toppings that you enjoy would work, of course. Here's what I did today. Pounded together using a mortar and pestle, olive oil, fresh basil, Mediterranean olives, 2 cloves of garlic, fresh marjoram, and salt. With the pizza dough 1/2 to 3/4 cooked, we spread that on the fairly firm by now top of the pizza. We had 1 ripe tomato in the garden, so we finely sliced it and spread it around on top of that paste. Then we finely chopped 4 peppadew peppers that were blushing. They weren't all the way red, but they were still good. Those went next, and then grated mozzarella cheese. We let pizza stay in the oven a little bit longer than focaccia because we like the crust crispier on it. I took note, and it was 24 minutes from going back in the oven to this point. Here it is done, and it was absolutely fabulous. Of course, you can personalize this to be any kind of pizza that you want. This is just a good, basic, flexible recipe.